October 2022, Sydney Airport. The usual hum of activity fills the air. Passengers checking in, bags being loaded, planes taking off and landing on schedule. Everything appears normal, but in the cargo area, away from the public eye, something is very, very wrong. Two airport employees exchange a brief look as they move through the restricted zones. To anyone watching, it might seem like nothing, just colleagues going about their day. But this glance carries weight. It carries secrets. Secrets worth millions of dollars. Secrets that could cost lives. Secrets that would eventually unravel an entire criminal empire hidden within the very infrastructure designed to keep Australia safe. For years, these employees had been trusted. They had access to areas most people would never see. They knew the schedules, the security protocols, the blind spots. They understood how the system worked because they were part of it. They were insiders. And insiders, when corrupted, are the most dangerous criminals of all because they don't break into the system. They don't need to bypass security or forge credentials. They are the system. They have the keys, the codes, the clearances, and when someone with that kind of access decides to betray their oath, the consequences can be catastrophic. Employee A had worked at Sydney Airport for years, a baggage handler. On paper, he was the model employee, reliable, punctual, never raised suspicion. His colleagues trusted him. His supervisors trusted him. He knew everyone's names, shared jokes during breaks, helped new workers learn the ropes. To the outside world, he was just another face in the crowd of thousands who keep airports running every single day. And that trust was his greatest weapon. Because while everyone else was doing their jobs, employee A was doing something else entirely. He was working with criminals, international drug traffickers, people who saw Australia's borders not as barriers, but as opportunities. People who were willing to pay enormous sums of money to anyone who could help them move their product undetected. It started small, as these things often do. A misplaced bag here, a delayed inspection there, nothing that would raise alarms, nothing that would trigger an investigation. Just small irregularities that could easily be explained away as human error or system glitches. But over time, the operation grew. What began as minor errors turned into deliberate sabotage. Employee A wasn't just moving luggage anymore. He was moving cocaine, hundreds of kilograms of it. Shipments arriving from Johannesburg, carefully packed and labeled to avoid detection. And he wasn't working alone. There were others. Other insiders embedded within the airport's infrastructure, all playing their part in a meticulously planned smuggling operation. Some worked in cargo handling, others in security. Each person had a specific role, a specific function that made the operation possible. It was a well-oiled machine, operating in the shadows of one of Australia's busiest international hubs. The drugs came in on commercial flights, hidden among legitimate cargo. The packaging was sophisticated, designed to fool scanning equipment and drug-sniffing dogs. But even the best concealment methods have weaknesses, and that's where the insiders came in. They knew which shipments to flag for inspection and which ones to let through. They knew when security would be lightest, when supervisors would be distracted, when cameras would be pointed elsewhere. They had mapped out every vulnerability in the system and exploited them with ruthless efficiency. And for months, maybe even longer, it worked perfectly. The drugs flowed through Sydney Airport like water through a broken dam, flooding the streets of Australia with poison. Cocaine worth tens of millions of dollars, destined for dealers, users, and the countless lives that would be destroyed in its wake. But then, someone noticed. An anonymous tip came into the Australian Federal Police in October 2022. It was vague at first, just a report of suspicious activity near the cargo area. An airline employee had seen something that didn't sit right. Maybe it was the way certain bags were being handled. Maybe it was a conversation overheard in passing. Maybe it was just gut instinct, that nagging feeling that something was off. Whatever it was, they trusted their instincts and made the call. And that single act of courage would change everything. The kind of thing that could easily be dismissed as paranoia or misunderstanding. But the AFP didn't dismiss it. They took it seriously. They investigated, and what they found was far worse than anyone could have imagined. The tip led them to Employee A, and Employee A led them to a sprawling criminal network that stretched from Sydney to Johannesburg, moving drugs worth over $150 million across international borders. This wasn't just a few corrupt employees making extra money on the side. This was organized crime at its highest level, a sophisticated operation involving multiple countries, multiple players, and millions of dollars in illegal profits. And it was happening right under everyone's noses, hidden in plain sight within one of the nation's most secure facilities. The scale of the operation was staggering. The AFP realized they weren't just dealing with a local problem. This was an international crisis. The AFP knew they had to move move carefully. One wrong step and the entire operation could collapse. The criminals would disappear, evidence would be destroyed, witnesses would be silenced, so they watched. They monitored communications, tapping phones, and tracking digital footprints. They followed suspects, documenting their movements, their meetings, their connections. They built their case piece by piece, gathering evidence with the patience of hunters stalking dangerous prey. And as they dug deeper, the scale of the operation became clear. Over 100 kilograms of cocaine had already been smuggled through Sydney Airport. That's not just a significant amount. It's enough to supply a major city for months. Cocaine that was destined for the streets of Australia, fueling addiction, violence, gang warfare, and death. And the insiders had made it all possible. They had exploited their positions, their access, their trust. They had turned the airport into a gateway for one of the world's most dangerous drugs. The investigation revealed something even more chilling. This wasn't just about greed, though the money was certainly a factor. The sums being paid to the insiders were substantial, enough to justify the risk in their minds. But it was also about power, about being part of something bigger. The criminal network behind the operation was sophisticated, ruthless, and well-connected. They had contacts in South Africa, where much of the cocaine originated. They had connections to international cartels, groups that controlled drug trafficking routes spanning multiple continents. And they had a system so efficient, so carefully designed, that it had been running for months, possibly years, without detection. The insiders weren't just employees who made a bad decision one day. They were key operatives in a global drug trafficking ring, trained, disciplined, committed. And they had been doing this for a long time. The AFP uncovered encrypted communications between the insiders and their handlers overseas. They found coded language discussing shipments, payments, and schedules. They traced financial transactions showing large sums of money being transferred to offshore accounts. The evidence was mounting, and with each new discovery, the picture became clearer. This was a professional operation, run by people who understood the risks and had taken extensive precautions to avoid detection. But no operation is perfect, and eventually everyone makes a mistake. But now the AFP was closing in. After months of surveillance, after countless hours of investigative work, after building an airtight case that would stand up in court, they were ready. The operation was given a code name. The targets were identified. Every member of the network, from the insiders at the airport to the mid-level coordinators to the higher-ups managing the overseas connections. The arrest teams were assembled. Tactical units prepared for the possibility of resistance. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence. Warrants were issued. And on a quiet morning in Sydney, everything came to a head. Multiple locations were raided simultaneously. The coordination was flawless. At the airport, employee A was taken into custody as he arrived for his shift, walking through the same doors he'd passed through hundreds of times before. He didn't resist. He didn't run. He knew it was over. The look on his face said everything. Shock, resignation, maybe even a hint of relief that the constant fear of being caught was finally over. In Hillsdale and Rushcutters Bay, other members of the network were arrested. Some tried to flee, scrambling out back doors and over fences, but police had every exit covered. Others stood frozen, unable to believe what was happening, their carefully constructed lives crumbling in an instant. But it didn't matter. The AFP had them, all of them. The entire network, from top to bottom, was dismantled in a single coordinated strike. The arrests sent shockwaves through the airport and beyond. Colleagues who had worked alongside these people for years were stunned, struggling to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the criminal they'd become. How could this have happened? How could people they trusted, people they'd had coffee with and celebrated birthdays with, have betrayed them so completely? The sense of betrayal was overwhelming. The public reaction was even stronger. News of the bust dominated headlines across Australia and internationally. $150 million worth of cocaine, corrupt airport staff, a massive international smuggling ring operating from one of the country's busiest airports. It was the kind of story that made people question everything. If this could happen at Sydney Airport with all its security measures and oversight, what else was slipping through the cracks? What other systems had been compromised? The AFP held a press conference that was broadcast live across the nation. They detailed the operation, the arrests, the scale of the trafficking ring, and the meticulous investigation that had brought it down. They praised the anonymous tipster whose report had started it all, emphasizing that ordinary citizens play a crucial role in fighting crime. They emphasized that this was a victory for law enforcement, proof that no criminal network, no matter how sophisticated or well-connected, is untouchable. But they also issued a stark warning. This case was a reminder that the greatest threats often come from within, that trust, once broken, can have devastating consequences that ripple through entire communities, and that vigilance, constant, unwavering vigilance, is the only way to protect the systems we rely on every day. For the families of those affected by the drug trade, the arrests brought a complex complex mix of emotions. There was relief that these criminals had been caught, that the pipeline had been shut down. There was satisfaction in seeing justice served, but it was bittersweet because the drugs that had already made it through the airport were already on the streets, already destroying lives, already tearing families apart. The insiders had enabled that suffering. They had prioritized profit over people, money over morality, and now they would face the consequences. The legal proceedings that followed were exhaustive and closely watched by the public. The evidence was overwhelming. Surveillance footage, recorded communications, financial records, testimony from other law enforcement agencies, forensic analysis of the drug shipments. The defense had little room to maneuver. The insiders were charged with serious offenses: drug trafficking, conspiracy, corruption, betrayal of public trust. The penalties were severe: years, even decades in prison, lives ruined, careers destroyed, families devastated. But for many watching, it wasn't enough, because the damage had already been done. Lives had been lost to overdoses. Communities had been ravaged by addiction, and that couldn't be undone by any court sentence. In the aftermath of the bust, Sydney Airport underwent significant and costly changes. Security protocols were completely overhauled and tightened. Background checks for employees became more rigorous and frequent. New oversight measures were put in place, including random inspections and increased surveillance of cargo areas. Independent auditors were brought in to identify additional vulnerabilities. Training programs were expanded to help employees recognize and report suspicious behavior.